This is my first video for Inspire Reflection, and I had expected it was going to be a standard Street Epistemology style conversation. I hadn't spoken to Mike before our conversation, so I didn't really know anything about him or his views going in. So what you're seeing here is genuinely a first conversation between two strangers on what can be a contentious and difficult topic. However, the conversation was in no way difficult or contentious. It also ended up not being the Street Epistemology interview I had expected. In general, in Street Epistemology, we want to avoid delivering our own truths and views and opinions, as the focus should be on helping our conversation partner explore their epistemology, not comparing it with our own. However, early on in this conversation, it became apparent that Mike wasn't really looking to explore a claim, but rather explore epistemology with someone who held a different worldview. In other words, I don't think Mike wanted to speak to a street epistemologist so much as he wanted to speak to an atheist. As a result, I felt the need to step into the conversation in a way that would not usually be encouraged within the standard practice of street epistemology. Despite this, the goal remained the same, to respectfully encourage my conversation partner to reflect on their position. And I genuinely feel that this conversation was effective despite this atypical form. We spent much of the conversation discovering things about which we mostly agreed. Most fundamentally, that certainty wasn't a position that either of us were prepared to take. The critical difference seemed to be how open we were to the possibility of supernatural explanations. As a side note, Mike is in LA and I'm based in London. The best time we could find to record was 11 in the evening for me. Worse still, this came on the back of a long work day and also a 3-hour live stream. As a result, I was not communicating as effectively as I would have liked. However, Mike was highly charitable throughout the conversation, and in many ways demonstrating some of the best principles of street epistemology. I only discovered later that Mike held a bachelor's degree in biology, a master's degree in theology, and is currently in the final stages of a ministry doctoral program. He has kindly provided a mini bio, which I've also provided in the description below. Mike has also suggested that he'd like to do his own commentary on this video, and I will provide the video to him, and I will also link to his reaction to it in the video description as soon as that becomes available. Mike is a great example of somebody who really is worth talking to on these issues. We have already arranged our next conversation, and I'm genuinely looking forward to continuing our discussion. Hi, Mike.
Hey.
Hey, how you doing?
Good to see you. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Good. Are you still awake? Are you still able to?
Just about, yes, holding on today. Just before we get started, just to let you know, I started the recording when you entered the room. So we're being recorded, and I just want to make sure that you're okay with that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, still awake, just about hanging on, I think, today. It's been a busy day, but not a bad day, I would say, for sure. Thank you for doing this. You joined the room at exactly 11 o'clock to the second. It's quite remarkable. Punctuality is a good thing. Right. So I just have a few questions just to set up the sort of recording and just where we're at. So you're happy to be recorded. Today is the 15th of February, 2022, and you are over the age of 18. Is that right?
Yeah. Is it possible for me to get a copy of the video?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I can send this over. Would you like as in a link to the YouTube publication of this video, or do you want your
I guess I could download it off of YouTube, but it might be higher quality if I get the
Sure. Yeah, I could do that for you. No problem at all. So at the end of the interview, we're going to just check in with you just to find out that if you're comfortable with the video and how it went. And if you're not comfortable with it, like, I'm happy to not have this be published. So don't feel like you're under any obligation to have this published at the end of it. If you're not comfortable, happy to stop it. We've currently got a pre-arranged time slot of about 30 minutes for the conversation. Just want to make sure that, to respect your time, that do you have a hard stop at the end of that 30 minutes, or if we need to go on a little longer? Okay, cool. I don't tend to want to go on too long, but I think 30 minutes is a time box. But if we get into an interesting conversation, I just want to know whether to end for you. Cool. And in this conversation, I'm going to refer to you as Mike. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm Will or William, either way. Okay. So you recently joined the SC Discord server, and that's how we met virtually, as it were?
Yeah.
Awesome. And what brought you to the SC Discord server?
It wasn't like a calculated decision. I've been kind of following you guys on Facebook a little bit, and I thought I'll stop in and see what's going on in there.
Gotcha. Yeah, no problems. And so you've seen SE be done before?
Yeah, I've seen it before.
Awesome. Cool. So some of this will definitely be familiar. Pattern's pretty much the same. We'll just see how we feel about it, and hopefully it'll be fun. What's the claim that you would like to explore today?
I guess I should have came with a claim. Huh?
Well, we can find one together. So I'm happy to explore any claim with you.
Well, hey, let's go with what I had in my introduction. So I've been following the debates for decades, and I'm kind of tired of how things go usually.
Right.
And I've been exploring the possibility of finding some kind of middle ground. Now, I don't think it's of any benefit to an atheist necessarily, except in that it might kind of like build a bridge between the extremes, because it seems like we're just talking past each other. I mean, like, I don't know how many like actual debates you guys follow, but it's always the same. Like, the atheist has a series of arguments and they're convinced that there's no way around them and they're right. And then the apologist has their arguments, and it's like, as far as they're concerned, there's no logical way to escape the conclusions of those arguments. And we just keep saying the same thing for decades, and nobody ever like seems to move out of that or make any kind of progress in the whole conversation. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this, and I'm trying to explore other options. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. That just to speak on that for a moment. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think debate tends to be more performance art than it is necessarily persuasion or articulating, convincing points or helping people find better reasons for believing what they believe. And I think SE is definitely seeking to be an alternative approach to having conversations that is not debate, precisely because of the reasons you just articulated. So hopefully you'll enjoy the SE community a little better than some of the other spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of SE, obviously we tried to focus on claims that people believe to be true. Ideally, they're claims about the world that you would say you might act differently in the world were you to believe them not to be true, or potentially even ideas that you're not sure about. We could explore a position about which you're not certain. Those would all be valid topics, but it really can be anything you like.
Okay, so my kind of the way where my thoughts are these days, it's kind of like this. It seems to me that most atheists I interact with come from kind of a Cartesian angle to their entire epistemology. They basically say, like, let's start with the bare minimum of basic assumptions that are unavoidable, and then let's only add things that we can be confident are true, as much as it's humanly possible to be confident, and that generally means scientific facts. But to me, even the most basic assumptions we start with have certain presuppositions, require certain assumptions, because I mean, Descartes, when he reasoned his way back, and I'm assuming you're familiar with all this stuff,
yeah.
When he reasoned his way back, he got to the point where he said, well, the only thing I can be sure of is that I exist, because everything else would just be an illusion, right? I mean, we could be in the Matrix, whatever. And that's not a workable foundation for most of the stuff we do in our conversations, because we have to at least assume that the world is real to be able to do science, to be able to do any kind of investigation. And those assumptions are like, philosophers call them properly basic. I mean, we just take them for granted, so to speak, because we have no way to prove them. And we go from there. But those very assumptions require some kind of hypothesis as to why they're real. So, like, for example, if we're going to study the world, if we're going to study the world scientifically, we have to assume the world exists. But for the world to exist, it means that it got here somehow. So we need to have some kind of hypothesis of how it got here. And there's a limit of, like, there's many possibilities, but you can narrow those down to some basic possible options. And each one of those could be a separate claim or a competing claim.
I can agree. I can agree with all of that. There are necessary presuppositions in almost every. In fact, I would even go so far as every epistemology. And the question is whether we can I guess, be sufficiently confident that we're taking the fewest number of presuppositions into our epistemologies. But of course, there are always, as you say, we have to assume that the world is reality is something that we can explore, and that it's intelligible, and it follows basic rules, and that from there we can start to do science. But we have to make those assumptions. We can't use those tools to get us that belief. Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny to me that you said the fewest number of presuppositions, and I don't disagree with you, but I was just talking to a theist a few weeks ago who said the same thing. Like, we have to assume we're making the fewest numbers of presuppositions, because to him, the idea of like I'm missing the expression right now, the prime mover is the least amount of presuppositions. And to me, it's like, why? Like, why is that the least amount of presupposition as opposed to some other one, you know?
It certainly sounds shorter.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But that's the thing. It's like everyone reasons within a certain framework, and they can't stay outside of it because that's how they think. You know, that's, to them, that seems the most rational way to approach the subject. What I do is I just treat them as hypotheses. Like, okay, here's one option, here's another, and until we're 100% or at least close to 100% sure that this is correct, then the other ones are still in play, type of thing, you know?
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, I can agree with that. Yeah. I think what I'm getting from this conversation is like, and I'm happy to continue on this, that there's not necessarily a particular claim that you're feeling like you want to make, and maybe we could do this. We could make an SE conversation at a future date. But like, I'm more than happy to continue to explore this epistemology discussion with you. I think that's a perfectly fun topic, and I would agree with it.
Okay, however you want to do it. I mean, I don't have an agenda. I just wanted to see what you have to say.
Yeah, same. Look, so yeah, I think I would agree with you. I mean, do you find, or have you found that the prime mover argument persuasive in?
You know, honestly, I don't. It's not that I don't find it possible, but it's not. I don't find it persuasive to the degree that people make it out to be. I mean, to many people, the prime mover argument is basically a end of the conversation. Like, once people understand that argument, there's no place else to go because you have to have a prime mover. And to me, it's like, well, yeah, but there could be something else that's a prime mover, and I always hear other versions of the argument, and I never quite find them persuasive to the level that a lot of philosophers take it to be. So,
I can agree. From my personal perspective, and as this is not an SE conversation, like just to be clear to anybody watching this, I would normally not step into the conversation in this way, but I'm really happy to have this conversation with you, Mike. From my personal perspective, the reality is either infinite, it had a start, or something else. Yeah. And all three of those positions to me are just bafflingly unintuitive.
Yeah, exactly.
Just none of them make sense.
Exactly the way you said it. It's like there's a limited amount of options, and all of them are unfathomable. Like, we can't wrap our minds around it, so we're kind of stuck in that sense.
I couldn't agree more. And so I think a lot of what starts to form people's epistemologies is, to a certain extent, how they deal with that uncertainty. And I think as a result, that's, for some people, that's reaching to God and saying, this uncertainty needs to be, I need to feel comfortable with this uncertainty. And, this is very much a sort of foundational God of the gaps almost argument, that we don't understand how it got started. So God is the prime mover, and now we can feel comfortable with the answer. I just personally have never been convinced by anybody who could persuade me one way or the other that they have an answer to this and it be intelligible. I just don't think there is an answer. And I think as human beings, we just need to be comfortable with I don't know on some questions.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think maybe where you and I will differ here is that you might take it to where, like, okay, unless somebody can demonstrate that this other option is correct, then I'm just not going to accept it. Well, to me, it's like, okay, there's multiple options. We treat each one of as a hypothesis, and we kind of have to pick one because we have to live our lives within a paradigm. Like we can't be practical agnostics really, because what do we do? I mean, what's the goal of my life? So end up picking one. And to me, it's like, okay, somebody takes this route and they decide to go in this direction. Somebody takes this other route, and I don't have a problem with either one. Like I think a person is being rational in taking those directions. So because of that, when it comes to the SE conversation, I don't really have a burden to deconstruct somebody's claim, because I think like, okay, what can they do? I mean, they're going to have to pick an option, and live with it.
Is it possible that some options are less justifiable than others? I mean, and might we want to choose options that are more justifiable?
I mean, sure. When you're dealing with limited data, like you take a presidential poll of like 300 people, and then you say, well, 250 said they voted this way, so I think I'm going to go with this. But if I take a bigger poll next week, it might change because that's just not a reasonable sample size,
Right.
So,
but in a given moment, given the limited amount of information we might know about something, some positions still could be considered to be more or less what we would call rational, right? Justifiable positions that you could take based on the available evidence, even if that evidence may change.
Theoretically speaking, I agree. I think, some positions probably are going to be somewhat more rational than the others. But, once you get into the conversation, it could go anywhere from there. But yeah.
And you mentioned, or you seem to suggest that there's a necessity.
Necessity. Yeah.
This is the lateness kicking in. There's a necessity to choose an epistemology in order to be able to act in the world, and I would agree with that. But I would wonder if all epistemologies are equal to that necessity. Might some epistemologies bring with them some additional things that aren't needed?
And really, like, so kind of, this is kind of how I think of it. I mean, you could come up with millions of epistemologies. And I'm sorry, my kid is in the background making a lot of noise. But you can have millions of epistemologies, and probably 99% of them are just ridiculous. I mean, I could say last Thursdayism, for example. If nothing existed before last Thursday. Sure. Who can prove me wrong? It's undeniable. There's no way to demonstrate that that's not true, but that's not a valid epistemology. But then if you kind of break it down to the lowest common denominator, you end up with like 2 or 3 options. Like one option is, for example, naturalism is one option, and then something other than naturalism is the other option. You could create a dichotomy that way. When you get to that basic level, you might argue, yeah, this is more plausible than the other, but still, like, I'm not sure we're in a position yet to settle the question to the point where you could say everybody needs to go with this if they're being rational. I mean, that's where I'm coming from. You could disagree, and you're more than welcome to tell me why you would disagree, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I would suggest that, like, so I classify myself as a philosophical skeptic, and by that I mean to suggest that I don't believe there is any position anybody can take with certainty.
Yeah.
Certainty is just doesn't feel like a rational move in my view. Mm-hmm. I therefore judge what I choose to take on as truth and confidence based on what I believe to be a reasonable degree of confidence that something is true. Yeah. So, I will say something is true if I'm sufficiently convinced of, its truth to justify that claim. But I would, in doing so, I would know that I can't know for sure, brain in the vat, etc.
Yeah. And I think most informed, sorry if I cut you off, most informed atheists, I think, would classify themselves as a theoretical agnostic, maybe a practical atheist, theoretical agnostic, something to that effect, where they admit the unknowableness of the situation.
Sure.
But
Yeah. I think we were just talking about that earlier today. Actually, the term atheist just means without a religion. It's not. Some people use the phrase agnostic atheist to differentiate themselves from the sometimes asserted true claim that they know there is no God, which of course I would say was a ridiculous position to hold. And so that would be me. I would happily say I was an agnostic atheist on that term. I just don't think all positions are equally. Agnosticism suggests an equality of the possibility space, I think. And I would not suggest that, in my view, I would evaluate the both sides of that potential argument as equal.
Okay, so how do you determine the probabilities in those situations?
So I think from my perspective, I would say that there is, I want to take in as few assumptions as necessary for me to function, right? Given that we can't know anything for certain, my basis is saying, what do I need to make a decision about? Where do I need to have confidence in order to act effectively and do things in the world? The position of God, from my perspective, doesn't feel necessary. And the reasons that I mostly see people feeling that it's necessary seem to be derived from the assumption that it's true. As in, to put it crudely, in very simplistic terms, you would only care about going to heaven if you believed there was a place, like heaven, and that was really a real thing. If you do not make that assumption, there's no need to work towards whatever the particular religion's view of what that is, how you should act necessarily to achieve that goal. So for me, I have no reason to believe in the position, and all it seems to do is pack unnecessary things into my epistemology that I don't think I need. I've yet to be convinced that I need, I should say.
I can see where you're coming from. I think I kind of set up the problem in my head a little bit differently. And it gets confusing because there's so many options. Like if you just go with naturalism, for example, there's just that option. If you go with supernaturalism, there's millions of possibilities, and we usually have a particular one in our heads that we're contrasting the two against, but they're not really equals. But I kind of flip it around and say, okay, things exist. They came to exist a certain way. And the two main options are they came to exist on their own by some completely natural process from beginning to end, or there was something else involved. And the question then is, how do I know which is more probable between those two options?
And I guess in my view, I don't know is a sufficient answer for me to be able to act in the world. I think we can make interesting discoveries. We can look into it, but as far as jumping to a certain conclusion on that point, I feel it's not sufficiently necessary for me to understand that in order to act in the world, such that I'm comfortable with saying I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and that's fine. That's why I think, like from my point of view, I think you're perfectly rational in taking that position. But then would somebody else be irrational for saying, well, since things exist, they got here somehow, for them to get here through natural processes, we don't really have an explanation for how that could happen. Maybe it just couldn't happen. We don't know. So I'm going to consider the other possibility.
I think considering it as a possibility, but is definitely not irrational. But I think acting unnecessarily in the belief that it is the answer seems irrational on the basis of the lack of necessity. I think, if nothing else. I'm sort of not skeptical. I'm a bit uncomfortable using the term irrational in that sense, but I feel like it would be a strange move to make if you didn't have to make it, and I don't think we do.
I mean, like, how would we apply it to some other question? Like, this is an example I sometimes use when I'm teaching like basic science to kids, because I every now and then I do public school. I teach public school and stuff. So I tell them, like, okay, let's say you're sitting on the couch one evening reading a book and you have your light on and the light goes off, right? So you're thinking, okay, what happened? Maybe the light bulb went out, but there's other lights in the room that also went out, so it can be the light bulb. So you're thinking, well, it's either that a breaker, there's a breaker problem in the house, or maybe there's a blackout in the neighborhood, you know? At that moment in time, you don't have enough information to decide which it is. You have to go and check on one or the other. So at that point in time, I don't see how you would say there's a certain probability. Like, you would say, well, until I'm convinced that it's a blackout, I'm going to assume it's a bad breaker. Or until I know it's a bad breaker, I'm going to assume it's a blackout. There's not really a ratio there where you could say 90% of the time it happens this way and 10% it happens the other way. So you're just left with those. And then you get up and you look outside, then you have additional data, you can kind of decide one way or the other. But I don't see why, like, if you're looking at reality and you're saying it could have happened this way or it could have happened this way, what makes it more probable one way or the other?
I like your analogy, but I think you might have missed the kind of texture of the move there. But because it felt like you could also say, as I've seen people do, right, that there's a ghost responsible for the light going out, right? They hypothesize a supernatural explanation for this phenomenon, and I think it might not be unreasonable to say that on a rational basis, the breaker going out or there being a local power cut are more rational explanations than a ghost has intervened with the working of the light. And the reason for that is that these other phenomena are known to occur, whereas there is insufficient reason to know that a ghost has, interfered with the light ever, even though it has certainly been suspected on many occasions. I think the non-supernatural explanations, and by supernatural, all we're really saying is currently not observed in nature has ever been proven to be the case, right? We're saying something entirely unproven has enacted itself upon this. If ghosts had become a viable explanation, they would become natural the moment that we could prove and knew that they were really effective in acting in the world in some meaningful way.
So what I hear from you in saying that is that you've created a sort of category where you said, yeah, we don't know how reality came to be, but anything other than the naturalist option is automatically in a whole different category, and it's a lesser consideration.
I would say that would be fair, except for the point where I would agree that a ghost is a viable explanation and becomes included in naturalism the moment we have a sufficient reason to believe that ghosts can enact and act in the world. So it's not closed. It's just defined by what we currently understand to be the world. And it certainly doesn't mean that I can know for certain that a ghost hasn't acted on this object. Maybe for the first time in the entire history of humanity, despite many people having asserted that ghosts have been real for a long time, maybe, as far as I can tell, this is the first time a ghost really did interact with the light in some way. There's nothing I could do to prove that wasn't the case in that moment until we start to explore other options.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to point out here is that I came up with an analogy, and my analogy reflects how I think about the issue, while your analogy reflects how you think about the issue. And there's a difference there, so we need to figure out why. So my analogy is basically there's a problem and there's two possible solutions. I don't know which one is more likely. I have no way to know until I do additional testing. Your analogy intrinsically assumes that one option is more probable. because a ghost is highly improbable by its very nature, right? So bringing this back to the issue at hand, I'm looking at a reality that it's hard to explain. We don't understand how things, is it that things always existed and somehow continue through all these natural processes to get us to where we are today? Is it that they came out of nothing? I mean, Hawkins and a few others have their options. There's Carroll that has his version of it, and a few others, is there some other way? We have this thing where like everything in the world follows, uses up energy to some degree. And we're assuming that over time, we're going to get to a state of complete, heat to death, as they call it.
Oh, right. Yes. Right.
So if we work our way backwards, somewhere there's a high level of energy, and where did that come from? Or how are we in this some kind of cycle? Like, what is the explanation for? And we actually don't know. But what seems to me to be the case is that you instinctively assume that the natural explanation for all this exists, and that it's more probable than some other explanation. And I'm not sure exactly how you got there.
Yeah. So let's just return to the point of agreement, like where we cannot know for certain any of these things. We could be infinitely under an illusion every which way. So certainty about it is not a move I can make. I'm certainly not saying the ghost did not turn off the light. That's not a move I can make intellectually, honestly, I think. Mm-hmm. I can make an argument for the ghost being a less likely cause of the light going off than phenomenon that I've experienced in the past having that same effect.
Yeah.
That's very different from me saying that I know a ghost did not do it. It's just saying that the weight of probability feels to me likely to be more in the space of things that I know can have this effect that are not ghosts. Until I can be sufficiently convinced that a unique, one-of-a-kind phenomenon seemed to be acting in a very special case here, I'm either going to be dismissive of it in the sense that I'm not going to take it as seriously as these other more explicit events. But at no point am I going to say that I certainly know that it wasn't a ghost. Maybe a ghost interacted with the breaker. I mean, it becomes very confusing. So, but I think with the origin of the universe, I think it's the same thing a different way. I firstly am more inclined to say that I don't know, as we seem to be agreeing. Like on a fundamental level, we don't know, and the question therefore becomes how do we relate to that uncertainty? I certainly do not know that an intelligent entity didn't create the universe, and that intelligent entity could have the property of somehow being able to act outside of space and time, and that it deliberately chose to create the universe with us in mind for some reason, in some way. It's not something I can disprove, but it would seem more likely to me that processes that we have observed to have complex consequences and interactions in our own sphere, in our own observable spaces where we do know things or have at least seen things happening. These kinds of processes may be something similar to something that gave rise to something as complex as our own universe, and maybe even to reality itself, the nature of which is so astronomically far away from our ability to perceive it as sort of animals and that deal with a very localized space of a few meters around ourselves, and we're trying to stretch our intuitions around something that I think we've never really needed to deal with until relatively recently. And I think therefore it's likely that our intuitions are going to be misleading. And it's likely therefore that we're going to try to draw conclusions where we perhaps don't need to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say I disagree with your rationale, because I could kind of see where you're coming from, in the sense that, yeah, you might say, okay, we've observed certain things, we can kind of extrapolate all the way back and say it's plausible that these things happen. And I think that would be okay. The question is, if we were to set up a scale, maybe, and set up the probabilities to where, like you could say, we could be confident. Like if we set this up as two options, everything that exists is the result of natural processes from beginning to end, or something else is the second option. So this versus the negation of this, like A versus non-A type of a scenario. I could see somebody saying, okay, on a scale from 1 to 100, I'm about 60% sure that it's the natural option. But if it was that kind of a scale, and if 60% was the place where I can confidently plant my feet, I wouldn't have a problem with somebody choosing to go on the other option, because a 60% probability isn't something to, like, if somebody chooses to go with the 40%, it's not like they're being dumb or anything. It is what it is, and live and let live type of a scenario. But I don't know if you would say, no, 60% is too low. Like, I think it's more like 80, 90, 99% or something like that.
I think my view would be the quote unquote rational thing to do here is just to say we don't know yet. We just don't know, and I feel like it's already taking a big leap into a space we don't need to take a leap into. Well, I don't need to take a leap into. In order to come up with the even the 60% option, in that case, it was a 60% option we didn't need to decide upon, and so the 40% seems even further away from me in that sense. The difficulty comes, of course, when the claim about the creator of the universe and reality starts to become infinitely more complex in its nature and its interactions with human beings, and the fact that there are people that genuinely believe that they are in personal and direct communication with this creator. This is an infinitely more complex proposition. I'm the prime mover or the deistic argument, is not. Again, I would suggest is, I can't say for sure isn't the case, right? It would be impossible we should do so, but it does get increasingly more difficult, I think, to follow the more this entity starts to have agency in its creation.
Yeah. Obviously, when you introduce something into the equation besides just the natural world, it's by its very nature going to become complex. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a Buddhist or Hindu or any kind of religion. There's complexity to it. Exactly. And the way I look at that is basically just different models. Like, the question for me in my interaction with atheists is, can we find a beginning space, like a foundation, where at least in the beginning we could say, hey, I understand, like, my position is here, but I can respect your position here, because we don't really know which option is correct. Our probabilities are skewed because we don't have enough data. Okay, the foundations are good. What are you gonna do now? And then the person builds kind of a model of their view, and somebody else has a different model of their view. But the basis is that there's rational space for the possibility of something beyond the natural. So, like, once you allow for that foundation, then there's room to build more. But if we don't allow for that foundation, then everything else is by definition not going to be rational either.
Yeah, and I think it's this nature of allowing for it that's interesting, and I think so. One thing I want to point out, I'm just conscious of time, but I would like to. I definitely would like to. This conversation has been far too interesting, and I've really enjoyed it, Mike. And I'm loathed to call it an end, but I'm also conscious that I'm running on lower energy than I'd like to for this.
No worries. And again, if you want to do this again, I'm more than willing to adjust to your time zone. Work hours.
I absolutely want to do this again. I would love to continue this conversation. I think this might be an interesting place to stop, because I think we've gotten to this the nature of the relationship between the natural and the supernatural and how we might relate to those things. I think is exactly where we should pick it up next time.
Hey, can I throw in 30 seconds more worth of more stuff?
You would be very welcome.
You know how in science, scientists like to build models that help them visualize and understand things. So probably the go-to example is the DNA double helix. When Watson and Crick were actually developing the double helix so they could visualize how the molecules were forming and stuff. And I think there's a possible model for this conversation, because technologically we're coming to the place where we could almost replicate reality within a virtual environment. So imagine a virtual world that is built exactly like our world, where like there's molecules that come together and build compounds and things like this, all the way down to the bedrock of reality. But it's all virtual, and there's like virtual people in there that don't know they're in a virtual world because their experience is the same as ours. And imagine that as a model of the question of natural versus supernatural, and if that's a possibility. So maybe that we can work with that next time we
I absolutely. What you're describing is often referred to as simulation theory. So the idea that we're in a simulated universe, and there are actually some arguments to be made that a simulated universe is more likely than a non-simulated universe.
So I'm not making that argument. I'm just let's use this as a model.
No, I think it's a good one. I think it's very good. Mike, honestly, this has been an absolute delight. This has been the cherry on my day, to be honest with you. This has been great. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. I will definitely make sure we can schedule. Let's maybe like put it in for an hour next time if you can spare the time. Or
sure.
I think we could do that. I just want to clarify that you're happy for me to release this video on the channel. Like I've really enjoyed it, and I think people might be interested in hearing the conversation and then seeing how it progresses. It's not a great example of SE, but I certainly think it's a great example of a fascinating and fun conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm glad to participate.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Let me know what you want to do next. Yeah, for sure.
I will do. I'll ping you some dates and some times, and we'll figure it out.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.